Greetings and bienvenue, MITZU. Thank you for returning to this broadcast, and welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
Some viewers may find the following video disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised.
I'm not going to lie to you guys. I sat and thought for hours about how to start this story, how to begin explaining what had happened to me when I was a young boy, and this is all I've really come up with. The start is pretty abrupt. I'm sorry for that. There's so much I want to say without making this too long, so I'll begin with what I remember before the odd things began to happen. I was a happy child. I lived with my mother and my grandparents, and for my first 7 years of life, I remember nothing but good things. My biological father was out of the picture, which is a boring story that has no connection to this one. My mother was happy too, and even though she had me, she was lonely. She was still very young at the time, and she had free babysitters while living with my grandparents, so she began dating again. All I really remember is she met a man whom she liked, and I met him one day. I was 8 years old at the time, glued to my SNES. The guy seemed cool at the time. When you're 8 years old, you don't really care about the grown-up stuff. They got married, and my new stepdad, who we'll call Dan, had 3 children from a previous marriage. We moved into town a few minutes away from my grandparents, right across the street from the Catholic church in town. The first month or so was fine. My new step-siblings were horrible children, but they didn't really bother me as much as they bothered my mother. It wasn't until about a month and a half into our new lives with this man that things got bad. Dan was, at the very least, a piss-poor father. He left his 3 children with my mother when she got home from work, and after he got off from work later that night, he'd head to the bar and come home piss-drunk. That was the new routine, and although I could tell my mother wasn't happy, she put up with it. I think she was tired of being lonely. That's the only explanation I can come up with. One afternoon, after about a month and a half of this, my oldest stepbrother, Steven, decided he wasn't going to come in for dinner. He told my mom to go to hell and stayed out on the playground until around midnight when he knew his father would come home. Right on schedule, Dan stumbled in around 1 a.m. looking for dinner. My mother, clearly flustered, was crying and told Dan that she just couldn't handle his children. She told him what Steven had done that afternoon, how he didn't listen to her. The walls of the house were paper thin, so even though we kids were upstairs, we heard everything. After my mother had told Dan what had happened, he calmly told my mother to hold on a moment. He came upstairs, grabbed Steven by the hair, and dragged him downstairs. What followed was roughly 45 minutes of screams from my brother. Over and over, we heard the belt hit him. My stepsister was crying, and my youngest stepbrother was shaking, and he kept whispering that he didn't want to be hit. It was a night from hell. Around 2 a.m., Steven slumped back into bed, and we were silent for the rest of the night. Beatings of this kind were commonplace for the next few months. Any of his children could be a target for any little thing they did. However, I was never hit. I think it's because Dan knew my mother obviously cared about me more than his shitty kids, and that she'd notice marks on me and that would slap her into the realization that I was in danger. However, one day he couldn't resist. My mother was working overtime, not there to stop any violence, and Dan was beating on Steven again. I was hiding under the kitchen table with my hands over my head, and he must have seen me and stopped. He made some remark about how weak I was or something. I don't really remember. All I know is that he was swinging his belt and trying to hit my legs. He was laughing, clearly having a good time. After about 10 minutes, he seemed to get bored. He walked over to the fridge for a beer, and I saw my chance to run. I ran outside across the street and saw the church as the only safe haven nearby. I ran up the stairs, opened the large wooden doors, and crept inside. The afternoon sun lit up the paned glass windows, and the building was just about empty aside from a man sitting on a bench about 4 from the back row. I've never been religious, so I'm still not sure what to call this guy. Priest? Pastor? He was wearing what I figured was typical garb for somebody who puts on the services. Whatever his title was, he was a kind man. He looked at me, gave me a genuine smile, and faced forward again. I had never been in a church before. I was only 8 years old, and this guy was the only person in the place. I sat a row behind him, but was close enough for comfort. If Dan came in, this man would have surely protected me. We sat, me and this man, in silence for what seemed like hours. The paned glass was beginning to lose its brilliance, and I figured the sun was going down. I got up, peeked outside the doors, and saw that my mother's car was in the driveway. I turned, said goodbye to the man, and quickly ran back home to see my mother. Going to the church became customary for me. Whenever Dan began yelling or punching walls or scaring me in any way, I'd run to the church. Sometimes there were people there. Sometimes there was a service being put on by a different pastor. But every single time, the man from the first time was sitting in his usual spot looking forward. I got closer each time until one day I was sitting right next to him. I found the courage to ask him what his name was. The man turned, smiled, and recited what I assumed was a verse from the Bible. I couldn't tell you what it was, what it meant, or why he said it, but it had a very poetic quality to it. I asked why he was always in the same spot. I asked why he wore what he wore. I asked a lot of questions, and each time he'd respond with some more Bible-y stuff. I felt that he was probably answering the questions as best as he knew how. The church seemed to be his home. Maybe he didn't converse very often. Once again, the colored beams were beginning to fade from the paned glass windows. I thought that perhaps it was time to head home again, that maybe Dan was asleep, or that my mother was home. As I stood up to leave, the man reached out and touched my arm, trying to explain what I felt as difficult. It was a warm feeling, but it left me with goosebumps, and although my heart was racing, I felt as calm as I had felt moments before. The man's eyes were different this time. They were harder and serious. He looked and sounded as though he was scolding me. He recited another verse from the Bible, but this one was clear and concise. A few years ago, I scoured the internet for the exact words he spoke, and the closest I could come up with was, "Do not be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good." I found that on some Bible quote website, and although it doesn't have the same poetic quality as what my friend from the church said, it feels right. After he said that, he gave me a small smile and faced forward. I headed home once again, confused about what he'd told me, why he said those words, and why he looked so serious. Fast forward a few more months. It had been a peaceful day, I remember. I got home, did my homework, played games for a while, ate dinner, and laid down to go to sleep. We were all woken up by a loud crash. Dan was yelling, and as I looked around, I noticed my youngest stepbrother, Michael, was missing. Turns out he crept downstairs for a Tootsie Roll. The familiar sound of the belt hitting his back was in the air, and although we all felt sorry for Michael, we were all used to the sounds now. Relief washed over Stephen's face when he realized that Dan wasn't coming for him, and although he still wouldn't be able to sleep for the rest of the night, he was happy for his night off from the beatings. I couldn't stand the whimpering coming from Michael. I opened the window, climbed down the side of our house, and ran to the church again. Looking back as I write this, I find it funny that my siblings never asked me where I was going. They never cared, I guess. It was late. Later than I think I had ever been outside by myself. The roads were empty, the houses down our street had all of their lights out. I ran up to the church doors and pulled on them. They were locked. I guess I hadn't realized that even churches closed at night. I had no idea what to do. My safe haven was locked. I panicked and I turned to the doors and banged on them as hard as I could. The sounds my fists were making against the hard oak doors were pitiful. I was tearing up, and soon the tears distorted my vision and rolled down both my cheeks. A voice behind me made me jump. "Looks like they're locked, bud." I immediately thought Dan had found me, and now it was my turn to be beaten like Michael was. I slumped against the church doors and turned towards the voice, but was surprised to see that it wasn't Dan. It was a police officer. At least that's what I assumed. He was wearing a modern enough uniform, was a tall, muscular guy, and had kind eyes like my friend from the church. "Is there a problem?" I laughed. I laughed and cried at the same time, but after a bit it devolved into just crying. Between sobs, I told this man everything that had happened to me since my mother had married that monster. He walked me to a bench beside the church and sat with me. He told me matter-of-factly that there was nothing he could do about my problem. He told me that Dan sounded like a careful man, and that the bruises on my siblings could be led back to any number of accidents around the neighborhood, that if he went after Dan, he would never get into trouble. The more the officer spoke, the more horrible I felt. I was stuck like this forever, until Dan killed me and my mother. Nobody will ever know. Guys, I had no idea what to do. After I hit this realization that I could do nothing to get Dan to stop, is when things got weird between me and the officer. "The only thing you can do is make sure he never does this again," the officer began to tell me. He started telling me how my mother's safety and my siblings' safety was up to me. He told me that Dan would kill them, and for an officer of the law, he used very descriptive and disturbing words to relay to me just how horrible our existence would be. I would have to stop him. It's up to me. I'm the man of the house. The more the officer spoke, the more I wanted to make Dan stop. After however long we spoke for, the officer told me that he had duties elsewhere and that I should get home because it's late. He smiled, told me it would be all right, and walked away. I watched him walk around the corner of the church, then out of sight. It had been a few weeks since I spoke to that police officer. He was right, I thought. Dan was a bully and he should be stopped. I dreamed that Power Rangers would kick his shit in. I imagined police raiding the house and putting a bullet in his head. I pictured Steven taking a knife and shoving it in his side. I hated him, and he picked the wrong night to fuck with me. I was under the kitchen table again when Dan got violent. Hiding places were scarce in our house. Upstairs, Dan could find you easily, and climbing down the side of the house took time. If I rushed it, I would have fallen and gotten hurt pretty badly. The basement was unfinished, filled with spiders, and Dan threatened that if we went down there, we'd regret it. In my mind, the kitchen table was the best option, but I didn't have my hands over my head this time. I wasn't crying, I was emotionless. I really think Dan enjoyed the fear, and I think that's the reason I was his target that night. He was serious this time. He grabbed me by the foot and dragged me out. His first swing caught me in the ear. His second almost missed. It grazed the top of my head. I kicked and screamed, and every time his face came close to me while he was swinging, I'd reach out and try to scratch him. I eventually, after about a minute, kicked loose. I saw two options. There was the door to the house roughly 5 feet away. I could have ran out that door, ran to the church, and hopefully talked to my friend. There were the stairs going up to our rooms about 3 feet to my left, and I ran up those stairs as fast as I could. On the way up, I had decided that I was going to kill this man tonight. He would not hurt my mother again. I would not hear screaming again. At 8 years old, I was the tallest boy in my class. My teachers had always asked if I played basketball, and they told me that when I finally got to high school that I should try out for the team. I never cared for basketball much. I was more of a baseball fan. I was terrible at the sport, but I loved playing anyway. The season was just about over, and I had all my gear upstairs in my room. I grabbed the aluminum bat and I put my back against the wall to the right of the stairs. Our house was overall a piece of shit. The stairs coming up didn't have a railing, so if you wanted to go downstairs from our room, you could just jump down over the side and land halfway down the steps. This also meant that if someone was coming up the steps, there were no guardrails, no wooden posts, no protection if something came at you from the side. I watched him come up the stairs. He was stalking me. The huge smile on his face pissed me off even more, and I watched his head poke up. Then his neck, then his torso. Finally, he was about waist high, about 5 more steps till he reached the top. I closed my eyes, screamed, and swung the bat as hard as I possibly could. The noise that followed still makes me shiver when I think of it. The bat connected somewhere along the bridge of his nose. When you're chewing gum, make a small air pocket in your mouth. Press the pocket to the roof of your mouth and you'll hear a sharp popping sound. It kind of vibrates the back of your throat. Then go to the grocery store. Head to the produce section, pick up a watermelon and drop it on the floor. The squishy thud sound the melon makes as it hits the ground. Combine that with the popping sound from the gum and you'll have the closest thing to the sickening sound that came from Dan's face after the bat made contact. I heard his limp body begin to fall down the stairs, and I knew he was still holding the rail. He didn't die. Of course, why would he? I was only 8 years old. A single swing wouldn't kill a man. But the rage that was pent up inside me was released with that one swing. I had nothing more to give. I turned to the top of the stairs and looked down at him. I could have dealt with anger. When I looked into his eyes, I expected anger. Hate. I expected that. And I think that if he would have shown me a look like that, I could have swung again and again. To keep that hate away from my loved ones, I would have killed him. If I had to. But the look in his eyes was something different. It keeps me awake at night. When I dream of hell, I dream of his eyes. It was acceptance. Not once had this man told me he loved me. He never showed me affection after my mother and him were married, but right now, after I crushed this man's nose, he looked at me like a loving father looks at his loving son. I lost it. I turned to the bathroom and threw up before I could make it to the toilet. I was screaming, crying, shaking, and weak. I stumbled to the window, climbed down that house as fast as I could, and ran to the church. In the corner of my eye, I saw the officer. Opposite the church, he was staring at me. No smile, no emotion, just staring. I was so creeped out I didn't know what to do. I pounded on those church doors, I screamed. Forever it felt like. and every time I turned, that officer hadn't moved an inch. The doors finally creaked open a bit. It was a different man than usual, but I didn't care. I was a fucking mess, and the man was obviously startled. He asked me what was wrong, but I pushed past him into the church. My friend wasn't there. I sat on the bench crying. The new man left for a moment and came back with a warm Diet Coke. "Sorry, it's all I have at the moment." He asked me questions, but he didn't push it. When I gave him short answers, he didn't pry for more. I asked him where the other man was, and he gave me a look of confusion, but quickly wiped it off his face and told me that he didn't know. I was sure that Dan would come looking for me, but he never did. I stayed in the church with the new man until the sun came up. He never asked me any more questions about what had happened, and I was thankful for it. All he wanted to know was if my parents had known where I was. I lied and told him they did. I told him I had to leave. I think I had to catch the bus to go to school or something. I had no idea how my life would turn out after that day. As I was leaving the church, my old friend was walking up the steps. We both stopped halfway and he looked at me with soft eyes. For the first time, he spoke without Bible verses. 3 steps into the basement, look left for a hole. Reach in, take what you find to your mother. He stood there and smiled, watching, I assumed, to make sure I made it home. Dan was at work. My mother was home sleeping. I opened the basement door and did what the man told me to. Inside, I found a bag that said, "Happy Birthday." I took it to my mother. My mother packed our things and we left in the middle of the night that same day. Inside the bag was a bottle of cologne with an inappropriate card from one of Dan's co-workers. He had admitted to cheating on my mother, and that must have been the final straw. Many years later, I told my mother what kind of hell we faced in that house, and she couldn't believe it. She knew Dan's violent temper, but had no idea what he was capable of. I never told my mother about my friend and the police officer. I never saw either one of them again. As we drove away, I looked at the church hoping to see my friend, but the steps were empty. This was a difficult story to tell. I'm not sure what to think about any of it, however, I still think about it all the time. If any of you have any insight into what happened, let me know. I've looked online, and without names or anything, research is hard to do. I'll answer questions if anybody has them. I'm not sure what else to say. I'm sorry if the story was a mess. I told it as best I could.
Holy shit, that was a good read. Any ideas about what Dan or his kids are up to now? And I'm sorry, but how could your mother not know about the abuse?
Yeah, I found my stepsister about a year ago on Facebook. She's a single mother with a couple kids. It sounds like from her posts that Steven is in and out of prison. Not sure about Michael, though. About the abuse, honestly, I don't know. I think she might have known about Dan hitting his own children, but my safety was most important, I think. I'm pretty sure she didn't know I was involved in any of it. She feels bad that she only got me out and not all 4 of us. But at the end of the day, she got her own son out.
Wow, this was a great story. You write very well. I'm sorry this happened to you. As far as paranormal, you could say that guy in the church could have been your guardian angel or something.
Even after this experience, I wouldn't consider myself a religious guy. It's hard to explain, but it didn't feel like some kind of holy intervention. Just felt like a good person helping me out.
Who or what do you think the officer was? The church spirit seemed to know that you were going to be tempted to kill your stepdad. The church guy and the cop remind me of those classic angel and demon on each shoulder scenarios. Maybe they're manifestations of your psyche caused by stress. Even then, this story is cool.
I'm not sure. I think it could have definitely been stress. Even though I was so young, he felt very real to me. And if it was a malevolent being, it was subtle with what he did.
The man of wisdom knew how to end it all. It's likely that he kind of understood your situation and went on his way to see what he could do, found the basement and the hole, and later told you about it. Still sorry you had such a shitty experience during your childhood.
Too long didn't listen.
Kid was abused by stepfather. Kid ran to church for safety. Kid met a religious guy at the church. Kid met a cop and tells the cop about the abuse. Cop tells the kid to man up. Kid beats up stepfather with an aluminum bat. One day, the religious guy gives a tip to the kid. Mom and kid find out stepfather cheating on mom. Mom and kid packed their bags and left.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel as more green texts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.
Remember to check out the Odyssey page in the description for a second archive of the channel's videos.